March 8, 1943, Mid-Atlantic, 57 graden 34 degrees Celsius. The water was the color of slate, churning under a gray sky that pressed down like a lid on a coffin. Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke stood in the conning tower of U-515, his face raw from salt spray, his eyes scanning the empty horizon through Zeiss binoculars that had cost more than most German workers earned in a month. The wind tore at his leather jacket, but he barely noticed. He was hunting. Below him, compressed into a steel cylinder 67 meters long and barely 6 meters wide, 48 men breathed the same recycled air, thick with diesel fumes, human sweat, and the acrid smell of battery acid. The boat rocked in the swell, a gentle motion that after weeks at sea became as natural as breathing. In the torpedo room, a young sailor from Hamburg polished the brass fittings of an electric torpedo, his hands moving in slow circles, the metal gleaming dully in the red emergency lighting. In the galley, the cook heated ersatz coffee on a single burner, the bitter smell mingling with the omnipresent stench of mildew and unwashed bodies. In the radio room, an operator sat with headphones pressed against his ears, listening to the crackle of static and the faint, coded messages from Befehlshaber der U-Boote headquarters in Lorient. This was the 11th day of the patrol. Henke had already sunk 2 ships, a British freighter carrying Canadian wheat and a Norwegian tanker heavy with Texas crude. Both had gone down at night, torpedo strikes that split their hulls and sent them to the bottom in less than 10 minutes. His crew had watched from the surface as men scrambled into lifeboats, their shouts swallowed by darkness and distance. No rescue, no mercy. That wasn't cruelty. That was war. That was duty. Henke descended the ladder into the control room, where his officers stood around the navigation table, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of chart lights. The boat's position was marked with a grease pencil, a small X in an ocean of empty blue. The convoy routes ran through these waters like invisible highways, and Henke knew how to read them. He had studied the patterns, memorized the schedules, learned to think like a British convoy commodore. By dawn, if his calculations were correct, a formation of Allied merchant ships would pass within 20 kilometers of his position. Fat targets, slow, vulnerable. They would never see him coming. That was the promise of the U-boat. That was the doctrine Admiral Karl Dönitz had preached since before the war began. The submarine was the weapon of the future, the great equalizer that would bring the British Empire to its knees. Surface fleets were obsolete, expensive, vulnerable, easy to spot and destroy. But a submarine could slip beneath the waves like a ghost, strike without warning, and vanish before the enemy even knew what had happened. Invisible, untouchable, invincible. Werner Henke believed this with the certainty of a man who had lived it. He had survived 17 patrols, sunk 26 ships, and returned to base draped in oak leaves and iron crosses while bands played and admirals saluted. The propaganda films showed him standing tall in his white captain's cap, shaking hands with Dönitz himself, the hero of the fatherland. In the bars of Lorient, other captains bought him drinks and asked for his secrets. In letters home, his mother told him the whole village prayed for his safety, but Werner Henke did not. No, could not know that the ocean had already begun to betray him. The U-boat was born from Germany's memory of starvation and its geography of isolation. When the British Royal Navy blockaded German ports during the First World War, sealing off access to food, fuel, and raw materials, the civilian population had slowly withered. Between 1914 and 1918, more than 750,000 Germans died not from bullets or shells, but from malnutrition and disease brought on by hunger. Children stopped growing. Women miscarried. The elderly simply lay down and didn't rise again. The British called it distant blockade. The Germans called it murder by starvation. The Treaty of Versailles dismantled Germany's surface fleet, its battleships cut up for scrap, its cruisers distributed among the victors like trophies, but it could not erase the strategic calculus that had emerged from 4 years of naval warfare. If Britain's strength lay in its control of the sea lanes, then Germany's survival depended on severing them. And the weapon best suited for that task was not the battleship or the cruiser, but the submarine, cheap to build, difficult to detect, and capable of inflicting catastrophic losses on merchant shipping. Karl Dönitz, who had himself commanded a U-boat in the First World War, understood this with crystalline clarity. He had been captured by the British in 1918 after his submarine suffered mechanical failure and surfaced in the midst of a convoy. He spent the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in Yorkshire, staring through barbed wire at the endless stream of cargo ships entering British ports: American grain, Canadian timber, Australian wool. The lifeblood of an empire. And he had realized that if Germany could sink those ships faster than the Allies could replace them, Britain would collapse. Not in a single dramatic battle, but through slow, grinding attrition, death by 1,000 cuts. By 1935, when Hitler renounced the Treaty of Versailles and began rebuilding Germany's military, Dönitz was already drawing up plans for a submarine fleet. Not dozens of boats, but hundreds. He calculated that to effectively cut Britain's supply lines, Germany would need 300 operational U-boats, a force large enough to maintain constant pressure on the convoy routes, while rotating crews and refitting damaged vessels. The Reich never gave him those numbers. By September 1939, when war broke out, Dönitz had only 57 submarines, fewer than a third of them capable of operating in the Atlantic. But he made do. He refined his tactics. He trained his commanders in the art of the wolf pack, multiple submarines coordinating their attacks, overwhelming convoy escorts through sheer numbers, then scattering before reinforcements could arrive. And for the first 3 years of the war, it worked beyond anyone's expectations. Between September 1939 and December 1941, German U-boats sank more than 2,100 Allied merchant ships, over 5 million tons of shipping sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. The British called it the U-boat peril. German submariners called it die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. U-boat aces like Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Joachim Schepke became household names, their faces plastered on recruiting posters, their exploits celebrated in newsreels. Prien had snuck into the British naval base at Scapa Flow and torpedoed the battleship Royal Oak, killing 833 sailors in their bunks. Kretschmer had perfected the technique of surface night attacks, using the cover of darkness to slip past escorts and fire at point-blank range. They returned to base with white pennants flying from their periscopes, one for each ship, sunk, and found themselves treated like knights, returning from a crusade. The men who volunteered for U-boat duty believed they were joining an elite warrior caste. The training was rigorous, the standards exacting. Only the best were accepted. They learned to navigate by dead reckoning, to calculate firing solutions in their heads, to survive on 4 hours of sleep and cold rations for weeks at a time. They were taught that a U-boat captain must be part engineer, part tactician, part psychologist, able to manage the cramped, claustrophobic tension of 50 men sealed inside a steel tube for months on end, breathing air that grew fouler with each passing day, never seeing sunlight, never speaking above a whisper when the enemy was near. They were told they were the tip of the spear, the weapon that would bring Britain to the negotiating table, the force that would decide the war, and for a time they believed it absolutely. The first sign that something had changed came not as a dramatic revelation, but as a slow accumulation of unsettling details. Captains who returned from patrol began reporting strange phenomena. Destroyers that seemed to know where they were before they surfaced. Depth charge attacks that were too precise, too coordinated. The loss rate began to climb. In 1940, Germany lost 24 U-boats. In 1941, the number rose to 35. In 1942, it jumped to 87. And in 1943, the year Werner Henke took U-515 into the mid-Atlantic, the hemorrhaging became catastrophic. Henke first encountered the new reality on March 9th. One day after he had positioned his boat for the anticipated convoy intercept, his radio operator picked up high-frequency transmissions, short coded bursts that suggested Allied aircraft were operating nearby. Henke ordered a crash dive. Standard procedure. U-boats were vulnerable on the surface, where a single bomb or rocket from a patrol plane could crack the pressure hull and send the boat straight to the bottom. But this time, something was different. As U-515 slipped beneath the waves, descending through the thermal layers where the water temperature dropped and the light faded from gray to black to absolute darkness, Henke's hydrophone operator suddenly stiffened. He pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, his face draining of color. "Kapitän, I'm picking up active transmissions." "What kind of transmissions?" "Sound pulses. Short duration. High intensity. They're searching." Henke felt a cold finger trace down his spine. He knew what this meant, though he had never experienced it himself. The British had developed some kind of underwater detection apparatus, ASDIC they called it, an acronym no one seemed able to explain. German intelligence reported that it was primitive, unreliable, effective only at short ranges in calm water. U-boat captains had been told not to worry about it. But the pinging that now echoed through U-515's hull didn't sound primitive. It sounded deliberate, focused, and it was getting louder. Range? Henke kept his voice level, though his heart was accelerating. Difficult to say. Perhaps 2 kilometers, maybe less. Bearing? 310 closing. Henke ordered the boat deeper. 200 meters. The hull groaned under the pressure, rivets creaking, welds flexing. The pinging followed them down, the sound reverberating through the water like the ticking of an enormous clock. And then, through the hydrophones, they heard something else. The high-speed thrash of propellers. Not the slow, heavy beat of a merchant ship, but the rapid churn of a warship moving at flank speed. A destroyer, coming straight for them. Henke's mind raced through the possibilities. The destroyer couldn't see them, not in any conventional sense. It was too deep, too dark. But somehow it knew where they were. Somehow it was tracking them through the water itself, using those sound pulses the way a bat uses echolocation, bouncing acoustic energy off the submarine's hull and reading the echoes. He ordered the engines cut. The boat drifted in silence, suspended in the black water, every man frozen at his station. In the torpedo room, the sailor from Hamburg stopped polishing the brass and held his breath. In the engine room, the mechanics stood motionless beside their diesels, hands resting on valve wheels they dared not turn. In the control room, Henke gripped the periscope housing and listened. The pinging continued, relentless, methodical, and the propeller noise grew louder. Then came the sound that every U-boat sailor feared, more than anything else in the world. The high-pitched whistle of objects falling through water. Depth charges. The first explosion hit 40 meters off the port beam, a colossal, gut-punching concussion that lifted the submarine and slammed it sideways. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation erupted from the overhead in a blizzard of fragments. A gauge exploded, spraying glass across the control room. Men were thrown against bulkheads, their bodies colliding with steel and machinery. Someone screamed. The emergency lighting flickered and died, plunging the boat into absolute darkness before the backup lanterns ignited, casting everything in a hellish red glow. Another explosion. Closer. The hull shrieked, a metallic wail that sounded almost alive, as if the submarine itself were in pain. Water began spraying from a cracked seam in the pressure hull, a thin jet under tremendous pressure that could cut through flesh if you put your hand in front of it. A mechanic scrambled to clamp it off, his fingers slipping on wet metal, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Henke forced himself to think. The destroyer was using a pattern, dropping charges in a preset grid, saturating the area with explosions. The only way to survive was to get out of that grid before the next pattern dropped. He ordered the boat to turn hard to starboard, running perpendicular to the destroyer's course. The electric motors whined as they spun up, pushing the submarine through the water as quietly as possible. But even at slow speed, the propellers made noise. And the pinging found them again. For 3 hours, U-515 was hunted. The destroyer circled overhead like a shark, dropping depth charges in methodical patterns, adjusting its course based on the echoes its sonar picked up. Henke tried everything, changing depth, changing course, cutting engines and drifting, releasing boldy canisters that created chemical bubbles to confuse the sonar. Nothing worked. The destroyer stayed with them, patient and relentless, and the depth charges kept falling. By the 4th hour, the submarine was taking on water in 3 compartments. The batteries were leaking chlorine gas. One of the electric motors had burned out, its windings smoking and sparking. The air was so foul that men were fainting at their stations, overcome by carbon dioxide poisoning. Henke knew they couldn't last much longer. He made the hardest decision of his life. He ordered the ballast tanks blown. U-515 shot toward the surface, breaching like a whale, water cascading off its hull as it broke into daylight. The destroyer was less than 500 meters away, its guns already swinging toward the surface submarine. Henke threw open the conning tower hatch and scrambled topside, white flag in hand, screaming for his crew to abandon ship before the destroyer opened fire. 47 men made it into the water. The destroyer's captain, an American named Harold Esperdine, held his fire and ordered rescue nets lowered. Henke was the last to leave U-515, watching as his boat settled lower in the water, the sea pouring through the open hatches, pulling it down stern first until only the bow remained visible, pointing at the sky like an accusing finger. Then it slipped beneath the surface and was gone. Werner Henke, the ace who had sunk 26 ships, who had dined with admirals and been decorated by the Führer himself, sat shivering on the deck of an American destroyer, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the empty ocean where his submarine had disappeared. And for the first time in his career, he understood that everything he had believed about U-boat warfare was wrong. What Werner Henke had encountered was not luck or coincidence. It was the product of a massive, coordinated effort that had begun years earlier in laboratories and research facilities across Britain and the United States. The technology was called Sonar, an acronym for sound navigation and ranging, and by 1943, it had evolved into a weapon system so effective that it fundamentally altered the mathematics of submarine warfare. The physics were elegant. Sound waves travel through water far more efficiently than electromagnetic radiation, propagating across vast distances with minimal loss of energy. A powerful acoustic pulse, a ping, transmitted from a ship-mounted transducer would radiate outward in all directions until it encountered a solid object, the seabed, a school of fish, or a submarine. Some of that energy would reflect back as an echo, and by measuring the time delay between transmission and reception, an operator could calculate the distance to the target with remarkable precision. Measure the bearing of the echo, and you could determine direction. Track how the range and bearing changed over time, and you could plot the target's course and speed. The British had been experimenting with this technology since the First World War, developing it primarily as a defensive measure to protect their harbors and coastal waters. But early ASDIC systems were crude, bulky, unreliable, easily confused by variations in water temperature and salinity that bent sound waves in unpredictable ways. A skilled U-boat captain could exploit these weaknesses, diving into thermal layers or staying motionless on the seabed until the searching destroyer moved on. But the Americans brought something new to the problem: industrial-scale engineering and mass production. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it had already been supplying Britain with equipment and expertise through the Lend-Lease program. American scientists had been studying sonar for years, not just for military applications but for oceanographic research, fisheries management, and undersea mapping. They understood the acoustic properties of seawater better than anyone else in the world, and when the U-boat threat became critical, when German submarines were sinking 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, and Winston Churchill admitted that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him, the Americans mobilized their scientific and industrial establishment to solve the problem. By 1942, American factories were producing sonar systems that far exceeded anything the British had fielded. These new devices, designated QC and QGB series, had greater range, better resolution, and sophisticated signal processing that could filter out false echoes and distinguish between a submarine and a whale, or a thermocline. They were installed on destroyers, destroyer escorts, corvettes, and frigates, hundreds of vessels specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare, rolling off assembly lines in shipyards from Portland to San Diego. But sonar alone wasn't enough. You needed a weapon to kill the submarine once you found it. And for that, the Americans turned to the depth charge. The depth charge was not a sophisticated weapon. It was, in essence, a steel drum filled with 300 pounds of Torpex explosive, a mixture more powerful than TNT, fitted with a hydrostatic fuse that detonated at a preset depth. There was no guidance system, no homing mechanism. You simply dropped it off the stern of your ship and let gravity do the work. When the charge reached its programmed depth, the fuse triggered, and the explosion generated a massive shock wave that radiated outward through the incompressible medium of seawater. Water doesn't compress the way air does. That's crucial. When a bomb explodes in air, much of its energy is dissipated as the air expands outward. But water resists compression, so the shock wave from an underwater explosion remains coherent and intense across much greater distances. A depth charge exploding 30 meters from a submarine's hull would subject that hull to pressures exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crack welds, rupture pipes, shatter gauges, and send fragments of steel scything through the interior like shrapnel. You didn't need a direct hit. You just needed to get close enough. And the Americans understood how to do that through systematic application of probability theory. They developed attack patterns, predetermined configurations of depth charges dropped in sequence to create overlapping kill zones. A standard pattern might involve 10 charges set to detonate at different depths, spaced 50 meters apart, forming a three-dimensional box around the submarine's estimated position. If the submarine was anywhere inside that box, it would take catastrophic damage. Even if it survived the first pattern, the destroyer would turn and drop another pattern and another, until the submarine either surfaced or imploded. The Americans produced depth charges by the hundreds of thousands. Factories in the Midwest, far from any ocean, stamped out steel drums and packed them with explosives, then shipped them by rail to coastal depots, where they were loaded onto escort vessels. It was industrial warfare reduced to its purest form. Mass production applied to the problem of killing submarines. Not elegant, not heroic, just relentless, overwhelming force. The statistics tell the story more clearly than any narrative can. In May 1943, 2 months after Werner Henke's capture, the German U-boat force suffered its worst losses of the entire war. 41 submarines were sunk in a single month. 41 boats, each crewed by 50 men, more than 2,000 sailors lost. Admiral Donitz, confronted with casualty reports that he could scarcely believe, made an unprecedented decision. He withdrew his U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes entirely, conceding, tacitly, reluctantly, that the battle had been lost. The men who went to sea after May 1943 understood they were sailing into a death trap. The casualty statistics were impossible to hide. Every U-boat base had a memorial wall where photographs of lost crews accumulated month by month, row upon row of young faces staring out from black and white portraits. The mathematics were brutal. A U-boat crewman had roughly a 75% chance of dying at sea. 3 out of every 4 men who descended through the conning tower hatch would never come home, and yet they continued to sail, not because they believed in victory. By 1944, even the most optimistic submariners understood the war was lost, but because the machinery of military discipline and national ideology kept grinding forward, consuming lives with mechanical indifference. Orders were orders. Duty was duty. To refuse meant court-martial and execution. So they boarded their submarines, sealed the hatches, and sailed west into the Atlantic, knowing that somewhere in that vast ocean, an American destroyer was waiting with sonar and depth charges. The psychological transformation was profound. In 1940, U-boat men had sailed with swagger and confidence, singing songs in the mess hall, joking about the ease with which they could sink British merchantmen. By 1944, the joking had stopped. The songs fell silent. The young sailors boarding submarines for their first patrol had the hollow-eyed look of men walking to an execution. Veterans who survived multiple patrols developed tics and tremors, unable to sleep without nightmares, starting violently at sudden sounds. One veteran, Herbert Werner, who commanded 3 different U-boats during the war and somehow survived, wrote in his memoir that the sound of the sonar pings haunted him for decades after the war ended. He described lying awake at night years later, listening to the creak of his house settling and hearing in those sounds the echo of depth charges falling. Another survivor, Wolfgang Luth, one of the highest-scoring aces of the war, suffered a nervous breakdown in 1944 and was removed from active duty. In his final report, he wrote that the Atlantic had become a graveyard where submariners go to die, tracked by sounds they cannot escape, killed by weapons they cannot fight. That was the fundamental asymmetry that doomed the U-boat force. A destroyer could hunt a submarine with active sonar, broadcasting its pings without fear of retaliation. But a submarine had to remain silent to survive, relying on passive listening and hoping not to be detected. Once the sonar found you, the balance of power tilted irrevocably. The submarine could not shoot back, could not outrun the destroyer, could not hide. It could only dive deeper and hope the depth charges fell wide. And hope, as every submariner learned, was not a strategy. There is a document preserved in the U.S. Naval Institute archives, a patrol report filed by Lieutenant Commander Donald McIntyre, captain of the British destroyer HMS Walker, describing an encounter with U-99 in March 1941. The report is written in the flat, bureaucratic language of military documentation, but the details it contains are chilling in their matter-of-factness. McIntyre describes how his sonar operator acquired contact on a submerged target at a range of 1,800 yards. He describes the methodical process of closing the range, maintaining contact, directing his depth charge crews to set their weapons to 150 feet. He describes the feeling of satisfaction when the first pattern detonated and oil began bubbling to the surface. Proof of damage. He describes how he turned for another attack, dropping a second pattern, and how the submarine suddenly surfaced, its conning tower breaking through the oily water, men scrambling topside with their hands raised. The submarine was U-99, commanded by Otto Kretschmer, the highest-scoring U-boat ace of all time with 47 ships sunk. Kretschmer was pulled from the water along with most of his crew and spent the rest of the war in a Canadian prisoner camp. In his interrogation, he admitted that he had never experienced anything like the precision of McIntyre's attack. The sonar had tracked him through multiple evasive maneuvers. The depth charges had been placed with terrifying accuracy. He had realized, even before the first pattern exploded, that he was outmatched. It was not a fair fight, Kretschmer told his interrogators. We had no defense against that kind of attack, no countermeasure. We could only run and hope was not enough. This from the man the German propaganda machine had called the Wolf of the Atlantic, the man whose photograph hung in recruiting offices across Germany, the man who embodied everything the U-boat force aspired to be. And even he understood, when confronted with American and British technology, that the game had changed in ways that no amount of skill or courage could overcome. By the final year of the war, U-boat patrols had become suicide missions in all but name. The average operational life of a submarine launched in 1944 was less than 3 months. Most never sank a single ship. They were hunted down and destroyed within weeks of leaving port, their crews dying before they ever fired a torpedo in anger. The destroyers that killed them were part of what the U.S. Navy called hunter-killer groups, task forces built around escort carriers, supported by destroyers and destroyer escorts, whose sole mission was to find and sink U-boats. These groups patrolled the Atlantic in systematic search patterns, using a combination of radar, sonar, and aerial reconnaissance to detect submarines. When a U-boat was spotted on the surface, aircraft from the carrier would attack with rockets and bombs. If the submarine crash-dived, the destroyers would close in with sonar and depth charges. There was no escape, no hiding. The ocean had become transparent. One German captain interviewed after the war described it as fighting ghosts. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. You couldn't see them, but they could see you. You couldn't hear them, but they could hear you. And when they attacked, it came from all directions at once, aircraft from above, destroyers from the surface, depth charges from below. We were not warriors, he said. We were targets. That psychological reversal, from hunter to hunted, from predator to prey, was perhaps more devastating than the physical destruction. The U-boat had been designed as a weapon of terror, meant to strike without warning and vanish before retaliation was possible. But by 1944, it was the U-boat crews who lived in terror, knowing that every time they surfaced to recharge batteries, every time they transmitted a radio message, every time their propellers turned, they were broadcasting their position to an enemy that had eyes and ears everywhere. The recurring symbol of this transformation was the depth charge itself, not as a weapon, but as a sound. Every U-boat veteran who survived the war remembered that sound. The high-pitched whistle as the charges fell through the water, followed by the gut-wrenching concussion of the detonation, followed by the groan and shriek of metal under stress. It was a sound that could not be defended against or evaded. It was simply there, inevitable as gravity. And all you could do was wait and hope that the next explosion wasn't close enough to crack your hull. In their memoirs and interviews, survivors described counting the seconds between the whistle and the blast, trying to estimate the distance, bargaining with fate. 5 seconds meant the charge was far enough away to survive. 3 seconds meant damage. 1 second meant death. And there was nothing you could do. No evasive maneuver. No countermeasure, except sit in the darkness and count, and pray that your number didn't come up. That was what American technology had reduced the U-boat war to. A lottery of survival where the odds grew worse with every patrol, where skill and experience mattered less and less, and where the only question was how long your luck would hold before the ocean claimed you. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the remaining U-boats were ordered to surface and proceed to designated Allied ports for decommissioning. Many captains chose instead to scuttle their vessels, opening the vents and sending their boats to the bottom rather than handing them over to the enemy. It was a last gesture of defiance, but it changed nothing. The U-boat war was over. Of the 162 submarines Germany built during the war, 784 were lost, a casualty rate of 67%. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force, 28,000 died at sea, and another 5,000 were captured. It was the highest casualty rate of any military branch in any nation during the Second World War. The survivors came home to a destroyed country and a shattered ideology. Many struggled to reconcile what they had experienced with what they had been told. They had been promised that the U-boat was the ultimate weapon, that their skill and courage would carry the day, that Germany would triumph through superior will and technology. Instead, they had been hunted like animals, killed by enemies they never saw, defeated by systems and mathematics they could not comprehend. Some never spoke of it. Others wrote memoirs trying to make sense of the waste. A few became vocal critics of the regime, arguing that the entire U-boat campaign had been a strategic error, a waste of resources and lives that had accomplished nothing except to prolong the war and multiply the suffering. But most simply tried to forget, to bury the memories of darkness and fear. The sound of pinging and the whistle of falling charges, the faces of comrades who didn't come home. Werner Henke, the ace captured by the American destroyer in March 1943, spent the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in Arizona. He never recovered from the psychological shock of his capture. In June 1944, he attempted to escape by climbing the camp's perimeter fence. Guards ordered him to stop. He kept climbing. They fired warning shots. He kept climbing, and then they shot him dead, his body tumbling from the fence to the ground, still clutching the wire. Whether it was a genuine escape attempt or suicide by proxy, no one could say. But those who knew him believed he could not bear the weight of what he had learned, that all his training, all his skill, all his victories had meant nothing in the end. The ocean had betrayed him. The technology he had trusted had failed him. And the invisible cloak that was supposed to protect him had been stripped away by an enemy that could see through water itself. There is a cove off the coast of Ireland where, on certain calm days, divers descend to explore the wreckage of U-260, sunk by depth charges in March 1945, just weeks before the war ended. The submarine sits upright on the sandy bottom, 180 feet below the surface, its hull largely intact but corroded by decades of salt water. The conning tower is still recognizable, though barnacles and algae have claimed most of the metal. The deck gun points at an angle toward the surface, as if still scanning for targets that will never come. Inside, if you have the training and the courage to penetrate the wreck, you can see the control room, the periscope housing, the depth gauges with their needles frozen at the moment of sinking, the helm wheel still turned hard to starboard in a futile, evasive maneuver. In the forward torpedo room, 4 torpedoes remain loaded in their tubes, unfired, their electric motors silent and useless. In the crew quarters, personal effects still litter the deck, a waterlogged book, a photograph in a corroded frame, a watch that stopped ticking 78 years ago. And if you listen, though this is surely imagination, the mind's need to impose narrative on emptiness, you can almost hear the echo of that sound. The pinging, the acoustic pulse that found them in the darkness, tracked them through their evasions, guided the depth charges down to the precise depth and precise location where U-260 was trying to hide. The sound that transformed the submarine from hunter to hunted, from weapon to target, from invincible to obsolete. The U-boat captains thought they were invisible. They thought the ocean would protect them, that darkness and depth would shield them from their enemies, that skill and daring would be enough to prevail. But the ocean keeps no secrets from those who know how to ask the right questions. And American sonar, for all its complexity, was simply a way of asking, "Are you there?" And listening for the answer that always came back, "Yes, I am here. I am trying to hide, but you have found me." That was the fundamental truth the U-boat force learned too late. Invisibility is an illusion. Technology is a force multiplier that overwhelms individual excellence. And in a war of attrition between industrial systems, the side that can produce more sensors, more weapons, more ships, and more trained operators will eventually grind down even the most skilled and courageous adversaries, not through superior bravery, not through moral righteousness, but through the patient, methodical application of resources and knowledge to the problem of finding and destroying the enemy. The depth charges fell. The submarine sank. The convoy sailed on. And in the end, the ocean, indifferent to human ambition, deaf to propaganda, unmoved by courage, swallowed them all. The hunters became the hunted. The invisible became visible. And the sound of sonar pinging through dark water became the requiem for an entire generation of men who believed they could hide in the depths and strike without consequence. But the ocean remembers. The wrecks on the seabed remember. And if you dive deep enough in those silent places where light does not reach, you can still find them. Steel coffins filled with the bones of boys who thought they were invisible, until American sonar proved them wrong.